Yeah.
Hello everyone, with me Ismail Fahmi here at Ismail Fahmi YouTube channel, and now with me we have Janet Steele and Andreas Harsono. Steele is well-known professor of media and public affairs and international affairs from Johns Hopkins University, and now she is doing a research in Indonesia, and her book Wars Within, the Story of Tempo, an independent magazine in Suharto's Indonesia, and her current work is about Malaysia Kini in Malaysia. And we have as well Andreas Harsono. Andreas Harsono is a human rights activist. He worked for Human Rights Watch in Jakarta, and previously he was known as a senior journalist in Indonesia, working since 1990s, and one of the founders of Yayasan Pantau Foundation in Indonesia. So let's welcome Janet Steele and Andreas Harsono.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, Janet, for being able to here with me at my podcast. I know that you are in Indonesia and we are all in Indonesia, but because of the situation, we couldn't get offline. But as you know, that Indonesia has progressed that much since 1990s, the first time you were both exposed to Indonesian journalism. Things have changed a lot. There were optimisms out there, and then we see the progress. And some people think about the regression of Indonesian press ecosystem or freedom of expression, things like that. So, but before going that, I would ask Janet, what brings you to study about Indonesia, and in particular about journalism? Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. I first came to Indonesia as a Fulbright professor in 1997. I was here for 1 year, 97 to 98, which of course was a very big year. I was teaching at the University of Indonesia in the American Studies program. I didn't speak Indonesian. I did have a tutor. I was sort of trying to learn, but it was all new. Before I came here, Gunawan Muhammad had won an award for courage and integrity in journalism in Arlington, Virginia. And I went to hear him get his award. And I was so impressed. I heard him say, I don't know why the Army should fear us when they're the ones with the guns. And I wrote that down on a napkin. And then when I got to Indonesia, it seemed like everybody I met had some connection with Tempo. And I was on a teaching fellowship. I wasn't supposed to be doing research, and they were quite strict about that. But sort of quietly, I just ended up meeting a lot of ex-Tempo journalists, and I started talking to them and interviewing them and just, taking notes. And then everything changed. The Krisman, the pro-democracy movement, the students, everything was changing so quickly. And then Suharto was toppled, and then Tempo got its license back, and I had to go back to America. And because I thought it would be interesting to write about the magazine that didn't exist, because it seemed to me that in memory, Tempo was perhaps even more important than it had been in actuality, as a legend, as everybody said. So, I cried all the way home on the plane, and then I realized, wait a minute, there's nothing to prevent me from coming back and learning Indonesian and actually doing research here. And so I did. I had a sabbatical coming up, and I applied for a research permit through LIPI, and I spent a year studying Tempo, because I'd always been a historian of journalism, and it seemed to me that there was no English language history of what's arguably the most important magazine in Indonesia. So that's what I did, and it was just a wonderful experience. I loved everybody I met. That's how I met Andreas, actually. He and I have quite a long history, going all the way back to, he was the one who actually told me about all of the underground activities that were happening at Komunitas Hutan Kayu during the Suharto regime. And it was amazing. That's one of my favorite chapters of the book. And then he and I started teaching together. We've been teaching journalism sastrawi, or narrative journalism, now for a long time, starting in the year 2000. So that's my intro.
25 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Andrea, so did you know Janet in 1990s or in 2000?
Oh, I met her before the economic crisis, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we know each other for more than 20 years.
Yeah, yeah.
So Janet
Almost 30.
Almost 30.
Underground movement. So you introduced Janet with underground things, and then are you still doing the same right now in Indonesia, knowing the recent circumstances? Or
No. No, it was terpaksa.
Right. Times have changed a lot since the 1990s.
Yeah, because like generations, we didn't really understand the situation before 1998, because back then, as a young generation, we didn't really know what was actually going on from the political elite, and then the narrative was unknown for us, people who are at school studying things that prescribed by the state, the history, everything. Yeah, so Pak Andreas, I knew you the first time through Yayasan Pantau, and you published a magazine. It was, I think that was an excellent work. I was a student, journalistic major in Pajajaran University, and then those magazines, probably we need to read the magazine, because our teacher told us so, and it was really amazing reading your work. That's the first time I knew you. So what happened back then? Then you try to establish that movement, that majalah or magazine.
Basically, the idea to edit and to publish Pantau magazine was providing a space, a media where journalists, academics, researchers, whoever want to write long-form reporting, write deeply, in-depth reporting, but at the same time, easy to read. That was the idea. There was a conversation involving Janet Steele, Atma Kusuma Astra Atmaja, Nirwan Dewanto, and some other researchers from LIPI, Lembaga Ilmu Pengetahuan Indonesia. Basically, they Gunawan Muhammad, they basically, those who oppose me, saying that there is no way we can have this kind of long-form reporting in Indonesia. Gunawan, for instance, said, people here don't read. They simply don't read. And I've been an editor for decades, I guess. It's so difficult to find journalists who can write. But there are also people who said that this is a country of how many hundreds, millions of people. Why can't we find people who can write long and deep and analytical? To make it short, someone tells me, why don't you do that? Why don't you start doing something like that? That was the idea. The idea is not simply about Pantau. The idea is to have a medium where people can practice writing deep, analytical, at the same time easy to read. That was the idea.
If I could jump in, I think one thing that was extraordinary about Pantau was that it was this in-depth, long-form, beautifully written reporting on journalism. And journalism is one thing that journalists seldom cover. So some of the pieces in there were just extraordinary. And then Andreas has collected some of the best in various anthologies, Journalism Sastrawi, that are really good, wonderful teaching books. When we teach our class, I love using the examples from those books because they're so good. And there was really, it's a shame, you know, it's the problem of funding, you know, that it was unsustainable financially. But anybody who has back issues of Pantau, they're fantastic. And someday, I know that the archives, I hope that they actually do get organized and online because they're so good.
There are archive, archive is full of.
Oh, really? So you can look it up? Yeah, okay, well then.
Pantau website.
People should look it up. I mean, pretty much every major publication in Indonesia, somebody wrote about in Pantau. And then, you know, disputes like in Ambon, the fight between the Christian and the Muslim journalist. This is crazy. Or, you know, one of my favorites is Chikrini writing about Aceh and how difficult it was to report on Aceh, even well into the 90s. They're just marvelous stories. Great one on Compass too, sort of about, you know, Compass's style of journalism, which has always been extremely cautious. You know, it's just the fantastic work in those magazines. So I'm glad they're available. So actually, how do people find it, Andreas? So you just search for what's the URL, or how do you find that archive?
Pantau.or.id.
Okay.
It is there. They are all there.
Yeah, things that I learned from you, Janet. You mentioned one of those examples. In one of your works, you can explain in detail how journalism worked in Indonesia back then, particularly at Tempo, through anthropological approach, right? Like you describe the situation in the newsroom, the ritual of praying, fasting in detail. Because for us, like we saw the events as something that is given, you know. We never
normal. Yeah.
We never thought that it was something special. So can you tell us more? Yeah.
The great scholar Marshall McLuhan one time said that culture is like the water in the fishbowl. It's the one thing the fish is unaware of. And so when you're thrown into a different fishbowl, like you were when you went to Australia, or I was when I came to Indonesia, or Andreas is repeatedly when he goes to different countries around the world, you notice things that to everybody else are just normal. And so Tempo was so generous with me. They let me just observe anything I wanted to. So I spent a lot of time at Tempo. And that was my first big book. The second one that I think you're talking about was about journalism in Islam. And that was a lot of fun because I actually, to the surprise of a lot of people, journalists at Republica were incredibly welcoming. Yeah, come sit and watch us. Do whatever you want. Ask us anything. Come to our meetings. The same thing with Sabili, which really surprised people. And then in Malaysia Kini, which is not religious at all. It's a completely secular publication, although they never wanted me to say that because it's dangerous in Malaysia to say you're secular. And then there was Haraka, which is a newspaper of the Islamist party PAS in Malaysia. So I figured these are 5 different publications with 5 very different approaches to Islam. I mean, Tempo is not, I wouldn't say it's secular because people there are very pious, but it is not connected with any religion. No, it's pluralist. And then Republica serves the Muslim community. Sabili, that's their whole thing, or was their whole thing. PAS was a political party, and then Malaysia Kini was secular. But it was interesting to see commonalities among the journalists at those 5 publications, which was very fun for me, and I learned a lot. And yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. One of the things that people would often say to me is Islam is a way of life, which obviously is true. And so if you're a Muslim, you don't even notice this stuff. It's the way of life. But to me, it was very interesting to see this is how Muslim journalists think about the same principles of journalism that I think about, or that Andreas thinks about, that the principles are the same, but how you describe them, or sort of the pictures in your head, are different.
For instance, in that important book, Janet compared the principle of verification and the principle of tabayun.
Yes.
In Islam. That is very interesting. I really recommend Janet's book to be read among scholars.
But verification is verification. It doesn't really matter why you think you're doing it, or if it's a part of your faith, or if it's just part of your job. But as Andreas well knows, that what separates journalism from just stuff you read on the web is verification, that somebody has verified it. It's true. It's factual. And that's what, that's the essence of journalism, verification.
It is.
Yeah, exactly.
Difference in journalism and propaganda, PR work, fiction, the so-called infotainment, etc. Art, of course.
Yeah. I've now learned about homeless media or nomad media, which I guess is a big thing here. All these people who are just sort of taking stuff and publishing it and have tons of followers, but it's not been verified. It's just stuff they found. I mean, that's not journalism. It's, you know, social media. It's interesting, but it has not been verified. So it's not journalism.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. It is not journalism.
One of the works that I've read is about Islam and journalism in Indonesia, because I've spent 6 years in Islamic boarding school in Indonesia. I was mesmerized with how you describe how, like tabayun, Pak Andreas said, the concept of tabayun, verification. Yeah. That's actually the first thing that I still remember until today, things that I learned at the Islamic boarding school when I was like teenager.
Well, that was one of the, I love doing that research because it took me places that I would never have otherwise gone. It took a bunch of different EIENs and UINs. And it surprised me that journalism at those institutions is taught in the Dakwah faculty, which is, you know, just completely foreign to the way Americans think about journalism. But it was really interesting then to talk to the faculty about, okay, well, how do you teach this? And it turned out, you know, as one of them said, you know, we use American textbooks, we use the same texts, but the context here is different, that our students are thinking about it differently, even though they are learning the same practices. And I found that very interesting. So I felt like my big argument was, this is not a different or lesser journalism. It's still good journalism. It's just a different way of thinking about the same practices. So, you know, that was probably, you're one of the few people who's actually, I'm talking to the two people who've actually read it, but that's, you know, as you know, with academic work, it's, you never get away.
The interesting thing about Janet's book is, of course, she is trying to approach media in Muslim majority countries, Tempo, Republika, Haraka, Malaysia Kini, and Sabili. And her approach is totally different from some people here who introduce the so-called journalismo Islam.
Right.
That is totally different. As if on the second approach is there is an Islamic journalism. There is no such thing, just like what Janet wrote in her book. Journalism is journalism. The context might be different. There are also, obviously, there are differences in Tempo, in Malaysia Kini, in Republika. Of course, Tempo people, just like Janet said, and I know many people in Tempo, dozens, hundreds of them. Many of them are pious Muslim, pious Christian. It is just fascinating to read her book on Islam and journalism.
You're so nice. It's actually been translated. It is in Indonesian, and boy, talk about something that was sensitive. I needed to make sure that I had a good translator. Several people read it to make sure that I wasn't saying something, you know, all I need is to do and come in and say something blasphemous because of a bad translation of something. But
10 years in prison.
It was, yeah, it was not a good thing. But, you know, it's funny. One of the things that I would tell diplomats who were coming to Indonesia was that, you know, we talk a lot about, Americans love to talk about press freedom. We use the word freedom a lot, which is a very Western concept. I'm not sure it's such an Islamic concept. However, independence is an Islamic concept. As you know, the best form of jihad is a word of truth to a tyrannical ruler. And you have to, this is, again, one of the basic principles of journalism. It has to be independent of the people in power. It has to be, or it's not journalism. And so I would tell diplomats, I'd say, look, you know, yeah, you can talk about press freedom, but people are going to say, wait a minute, we don't want your kind of freedom. We don't want pornography. We don't want cartoons of the prophet. We don't want any of that. So don't talk about that. Talk about independent media. And I think, you know, it makes a huge difference. Being independent is something that, yeah, we can all get around because it focuses on the real essence, which is journalists should be an independent monitor of power. And Andreas will recognize where I am getting these basic principles from a book that he translated many years ago, which I think has now been read by so many Indonesians. I don't think Bilkovic had any idea the following he was going to have in Indonesia after writing that book with Tom Rosenstiel. You should talk.
He
You
did.
should talk about.
He knew it. He knew it.
Yeah.
He knew it.
Can you tell us more about that, Andreas?
Well, Bill Kovacs is my teacher. When he co-wrote that book, The Elements of Journalism, with Tom Rosenstiel, I was his student at the Nieman Foundation at Harvard. So I know the process, the discussion, the fora, the multiple forum, FGD discussion that they did around the US. Once it was published, of course, it was a very good book. It was already translated into 20-something languages at the time. When I asked him whether we can do the translation in Bahasa Indonesia. And of course he did. And it became a very important book. December 2003, Bill Kovacs came here. He went to Medan, hosted by Analisa newspaper. And then he went to Jakarta, hosted by the Press Council. And the co-hosts at the time were Atma Kusuma Astra Atmaja and Daud Yusuf, two of my favorite writers. And then Yogyakarta at Universitas Islam Indonesia, another Islamic institution. They are so happy to have Bill Kovacs speaking at the campus. And then Surabaya, a local university, and then Denpasar, another university, Udayana University in Bali, of course. Bill Kovacs was impressed. He went back to the US and he wrote something for the Nieman report about his trip to Indonesia. He said, I have never realized that this concept of journalism is what is the word that he used? Is rooted in Indonesia as well, a predominantly Sunni Muslim country. It was 2003. And over the decades, of course, every time I went to Boston or DC, I obviously tried to meet him, my dear guru. And one day he told me, Andreas, someone told me that if they search the term Bill Kovacs and journalism, English, of course, is the number one result. The second is Bahasa Indonesia.
Yeah. Yeah. No, Andreas did so much to popularize that. But these basic principles are very easy to understand. Yeah. And actually, then I found that they're very easily converted into kind of an Islamic idiom. Because they're all, everything like speaking truth to power, being independent, being true to your conscience. That you shouldn't do something is wrong. Speaking the truth, serving the community. I mean, all these things are. Andreas has had such an amazing impact on journalism in Indonesia through all of these young people. He teaches constant course. I'd come once a year and teach a class, a kind of special class. He's doing it all the time. And, the thousands of young journalists, student journalists, that he's worked with who then gone on and are having great careers. So, yeah, he's an amazing guru himself.
So it's been more than 25 years since you were exposed to Indonesian journalism, including you, Pak Andreas. I don't know whether it was a destiny, something that came organically, or whether it was a conscious choice for both of you. So you've mentioned that it was like a kind of organic because you were visiting Indonesia and then you observed something for Janet, and then Pak Andreas, you were a journalist before, right? So probably it was a choice. Even your son is now a journalist as well.
My wife too.
Your wife too. So it is in your blood. So is it
in the family,
or a destiny, or can you tell us more about that?
In the beginning, I just loved to write. When I was in junior high school, Sekolah Menengah Pertama, I wrote in majalah dinding. What is it in English? Majalah dinding.
Wall, wall
Wall
newspaper.
newspaper. Yeah, in my school. I really love it. And then high school in Malang, I started to write for high school magazine. Wrote about music, something silly. I still remember I wrote about Genesis and the Police, the music group. But things became more, things became more serious when I went to university in Salatiga. I was lucky to know Ari Budiman, dissident / scholar, Josh Yunus Adichandra, also dissident / scholar. They make me to realize that journalism is very important. Writing in the general sense, not necessarily full-time journalism. The practitioner of journalism, writing for the public interest, is important. They make me realize that the better the quality of journalism in a society, in a campus, in a school, in a city, in a country, in a world, the better the quality of democracy in that particular society. And vice versa. If the quality of journalism, public writing is in decline, then the society is also in decline. But it is not static. Journalism in the US is going up and down. Journalism at the New York Times is going up and down. Journalism in Tempo is going up and down. And thus, we also need to criticize the journalists themselves. It is important to criticize people who work for CNN. You know, some CNN journalists can be messy, or some journalists in Indonesia can be messy, in Jakarta, in Padang, in Bali, whatever, in Papua, in Medan. Thus, that make me more and more interested to elevate the quality of journalism, at least in my own country, Indonesia. Later, I learned from Karl Marx, reading from Bill Kovacs. Karl Marx said that there is one profession in this world which demand independence, that it is difficult to say whether this profession is a profession, like doctors, engineers, based on their certain code of conducts, or they are workers, labor, because they are working in organization. They can be fired, they can be whatever, exploited, and that is journalism. Wow, this is a very interesting profession, because this is the only one, according to Karl Marx. And this is not only journalism per se, those working for Tempo or Malaysia Kini, but in general, people who want to listen, who prioritize the interests of the audience, the citizen, and being independent. That is a very complicated profession, because in some instances, these journalists, this practitioner of journalism, need to overstep the interests of their respective organization, and that is the key to their success. Just like Bob Woodward of the Washington Post wrote that when he wrote about the Watergate, there was the threat that the Washington Post company might lose their TV license, a threat by the President Richard Nixon administration, and they did that. They lost the license, but that is the key to the success of journalism. That make me falling in love entirely with journalism.
Yeah, but the problem now is that as Janet was interviewed by Tempo, and she said that the challenge now is about the funding, right? The business model. So good journalism requires so much money. Can you tell us more about that, Janet? The challenge that journalism faces now?
Yeah. I want to just quickly answer the other question you asked, Andreas, about how we got interested in journalism. My dad had been a journalist, and my brother is a journalist, and so I grew up around journalism. In fact, when I was a kid, we would sit at the breakfast table, and my dad would critique the St. Petersburg Times every morning, which I didn't realize. Oh, that's what we're doing. So I've always loved journalism, but I'm not good at writing on deadline, or at least I don't think I am. And so I took a longer view. So history is a lot like journalism, and I studied history. And then my dissertation was on a 19th century newspaper. And I realized there's a lot more jobs in journalism departments than there are in history departments. So I've never taught in history department. I've always been in a journalism program. But coming to Indonesia completely changed my life in 1997 to 98. I really fell in love with this place. And because I was here when Reformasi happened, you know, it was like, this is so exciting. And I want to be here and be part of this. And I actually have an apartment in Jakarta. That's a long story that's not worth going into. But I was also friends with wonderful, wonderful Atma Kusuma. And we used to talk endlessly, you know, when they were working on the press law. I was, you know, talking with him all the time, giving him models about press councils, how we could do this, how we could do that. And you know, it was so exciting to see that press law passed and to see the creation of the press council and to be in a place where it was obvious how important journalism was to changing things. You know, it was so apparent. And that I believe that Indonesia really has become a model for the rest of the region. You know, Malaysians pay attention to your press law, and their press council, if only theirs was as good as yours, would be great. East Timor follows the way that you've done it. So to be here and to see these things happen was really wonderful. Now the question about, yes, the breakdown of the model that has worked since the 1830s, which was created by the penny press, the idea that advertisers will pay access to you, the reader, that you are not, if you're buying content, that's not the real transaction that's going on. The transaction is advertisers buying access to you. Well, now advertisers have a lot better ways of reaching people than through, obviously through print, which is pretty much dead everywhere. And you know, news organizations have not really figured out how to monetize the internet, certainly not to the extent that they could monetize print and magazines and traditional television. So now we have such a diffuse ecosystem, and you know, I think everybody's struggling to figure out how to make money at this because journalism is expensive. We know that, you know, to do. And what's interesting is, from a historical perspective, is that it's always been newspapers that have driven. They've been the engine. You know, they're the ones that are doing the reporting, the in-depth reporting that gets followed up on by magazines. Television picks it up, radio picks it up, podcasts pick it up. But somebody has to pay for this reporting. And right now, how are we going to do that? And that is the big question, I think, facing all of us. You know, is it going to somehow be funded through a public corporation, public interest journalism? You know, is it a subscriber-based model? Indonesians don't want to pay for journalism. That's pretty clear. So it's a big mess. It's a big mess.
Andreas, do you have a comment on that?
There is a study by the Reuters Foundation Institute in the UK. The study was headed by Charles Lewis, a former CBS News journalist who used to set up the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. The study basically that there are 3 new or additional models for journalism. One is non-profit journalism. We have in Indonesia Mongga by Project Multatuli. These are non-profit. In the US, we have the Marshall Project, many others. That is number one. Number two, of course, the paywall. Just like what the New York Times is doing and making a lot of money. The New Yorker, Wall Street Journal, they are pretty successful in the US now, and also in Malaysia. Malaysia Kini is also having a paywall. Readers pay and support their respective newspapers. Indonesia is still struggling with this kind of model. The third is the NGO model. And Chuck Lewis basically said that there are many NGOs, human rights organization, environmental organization, think tank, that provide, just like what Bill Coffey said, information for the public, for the citizen. And the study suggested that let's make all these websites, including Human Rights Watch as a platform of journalism, because these are the journalism that the public need, maybe very specific, human rights, Greenpeace, environment, Amnesty International, human rights, many think tanks, or in Indonesia, Indonesian Legal Aid Foundation, YLPHI, Kontras, many other, AMAN, Aliansi Masyarakat Adat Nusantara, WALHI, the environmental group. Many of these NGO can transform their website with their podcasts, with their videos, into journalism as well. So basically, that is the study that Reuters suggested for new or additional business model to support journalism.
That's
Yeah,
actually
so-
one reason why, just to quickly follow up, one reason why Pantau, we would often, we'd have young journalists in our class, but also young activists from different organizations who need to learn how to present their material in an interesting way, because otherwise nobody's going to read it. And,
It is.
But again, for me, the problem with that is it's such a fragmented model that everything, even if everything all those groups is doing is great, we still need to understand what's happening at the Jakarta city government. Who's reporting on that? I mean, that was something that newspapers traditionally did. And so there's, in Jakarta and in Indonesia, they're just like in the US, there's so many levels of government that somebody really needs to be monitoring. And, the problem with the public interest model is it's again too fragmented, but it's certainly better than nothing. And this is the dilemma of our time, and no doubt about it. And
it is. That's true.
Yeah.
Just yesterday, I was in a discussion with my colleagues at the Faculty of Communication, Pajajaran University, from journalism major. They're all the lecturers there, and then they are trying to, answering what is the future of journalism, because one of them actually told us he is now doing a postdoc in the US, and in US basically journalism has died. Is that true, Janet?
Oh, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that. But I'm surprised. Where is your colleague? In what?
No, I mean, in terms, because one of the universities there actually, the journalism major was no longer there, so they replaced the major with different name.
Right. Well, that's why I asked where your colleague is situated, because I live in Washington D.C. and we've got the Washington Post. But
I forgot, maybe in Iowa or something. But I need to.
Well, yes, there are certainly news deserts. There are definitely news deserts where local media have died, and in fact, this is slightly off topic, but I believe that this is one reason for the polarization in American politics is that local newspapers were really in the mainstream and everybody trusted them. So they would, some were slightly to the left, some were slightly to the right, but they were all basically in the center. When those local publications died, then people started watching Fox News and MSNBC, which are way out on the edges. And so that has really increased polarization, that the traditional vehicle that everybody trusted was the local newspaper. And that's with its death. And so your friend is absolutely right about that. And I know we can look at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the LA Times, and say, okay, these are all strong. American journalism is doing fine. But you want to look at the Des Moines Register. You want to look at the Tampa Bay Times. You want to look at the Tampa Tribune, which is now gone. There's all of these local papers are dead or dying. So yes, your colleague is right in that regard.
Is it happening in Indonesia, Andreas?
Oh yes. In Indonesia, the problem is slightly different. The local newspapers, local news are still there, but they get their money from the government, from the local government. Whether you go to Banjarmasin or whether you go to Kabanjahe, you go to Medan, the local news are there, but mostly, quote unquote, paid advertisement by the government, or so-called, what is info commercial? How did they call it?
Infotorial or whatever.
Advertorial.
Advertorial,
yeah. We still have local news, but they are mainly
right.
advertorial from local government.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that's one thing that distinguishes Indonesia from the United States is that journalism here, high quality journalism, has always been very Java-centric and very Jakarta-centric. Aside from Surabaya, and Bandung has a really good tradition of journalism. Probably partly because of the universities there, but there aren't other great regional centers of journalism outside of Java that. Tell me if I'm wrong, Andreas. There's any other great journalism cities outside of Java?
People who have a very strong background in journalism, of course, hope that journalism will be staying for so many years. But we know the situation is pretty bleak at the moment. Yeah. So do you have optimism in that regard, or still like the same thing? Like I said, it's a bleak, and
Well, Americans are usually optimistic, even in the midst of the mess we're in now. But I do feel that I think we all know we need reliable news. We know we need this. And so I think we are in the process of trying to figure out what platform. One thing that's has just happened quite recently in the US is so many really good journalists have taken buyouts from their publications that are shrinking, and now they have Substacks. There's a lot of great reporting on Substacks, but again, this is so fragmented. Who has time to follow all these people on Substack? That the thing about the newspaper was it brought together all of this stuff and also forced you to read things that you might not otherwise read. When you would pick up a newspaper, you'd look at one story and then turn the page and you'd see something else that you'd find interesting. The fact that we have these targeted algorithms now, so that even when I look at the Washington Post website, it shows me stories that it knows I'm going to like, which is fine. I like them, but then that means I'm not seeing other stuff that I probably should see. So I think there are a lot of problems that we've got, and one of them is to get us outside of our algorithm. I don't need to just read stories that basically agree with my worldview. I need to read other stuff. And newspapers and even television news would do that because it presented a package. Now you can just read only stuff that you're interested in, which can be extremely narrow. So.
Yeah. So, Pak Andreas.
Yeah.
Do you have any opinion on that?
Apa ya? I'm not going to say that I'm a pessimist or I'm an optimist. I'm an Indonesian. I just decided to do what the best of the time that I have in my life. I have only 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. What I can do right now is to choose what are the best that I can do with the time that I still have.
Yes.
That is actually from the Lord of the Ring, Janet.
Oh.
Gandalf.
I still have my Pantau T-shirt that has a big picture of Bill Kovach on the front, and on the back it says, "Journalism is my religion," which I'm a little reluctant to wear that around here because I think that might be considered blasphemous. But I guess, yeah, I actually, journalism is my religion. I think if we were all journalists, we'd be a much better society, and so I think the need for journalism is.
And that's the title of my book. Agama saya adalah jurnalisme.
Yeah. Well, that's why. But maybe one of your friends, we have the same religion.
Yeah. So both of you agree that we need journalism, but the fact is that journalism that we expect is no longer there. I mean, like the quote unquote ideal journalism that we have in mind. Yeah. So
it's there. It's just there's outstanding reporting out there. The public.
But they are struggling.
Yeah, but the Pulitzer Center, I'm friends with Kwan Keng, who now is running their data journalism thing, and the stories they do are astonishing, outstanding reporting, often with Indonesians on environmental issues, on things that are just so important. So it's there. There is good journalism there, but it's no longer delivered in the same way it was and to as many people as it was. And I think the scary thing isn't the death of journalism so much as it is the complete fragmentation and polarization of societies, which is really bad. I mean, you found that in your own research that in some ways, even people who were reading Republica and people who were reading Koran kind of lived in different, really Republica and Compass were kind of living in different worlds, the way they saw things. And, both are mainstream, so neither is at all dangerous, but it was still slightly different. And if you can imagine exaggerating that even further, where everybody only reads the news that is from their group, that's bad. So,
Andreas, any comment on that or?
No.
Yeah. So after 25 years, more than 25 years observing Indonesia, so what have you seen in the last few years in terms of journalism in Indonesia? What to expect and what is your hope? What is the difference between the things that you saw in the past?
I'm worried about some of the legal challenges that have come up, and I am extremely worried about the new criminal code, which I guess comes into effect next year. And Andreas can certainly speak to that. All of the provisions, the foreigners all read this and thought, "Oh wow, unmarried people can't have sex in Bali." Like that was the most important thing. No, it wasn't. The important thing is all of those provisions which deal with restrictions on the press and criminalize the press. So I think Indonesia has a fantastic press law. And we just have to keep reminding people this is the law. And fortunately, Indonesian journalists are very active. Aji, Asmi, Indonesian journalists push back. But I'm not as worried about the decline in journalism as I am about the legal situation here, the political and legal situation. And Andreas, this is your Bollywood, not mine, but.
Yeah, this is very worrying. We are seeing more and more toxic regulation being produced in Indonesia. On the national level, of course, we have this new Kitab Undang-Undang Hukum Pidana 2022 to be activated January 2026 next year.
Yeah.
And on top of that, we have many discriminatory regulation, more than 700 made in the last 2 decades. So it is like slow burning issue. There are anti-religious minorities regulation. There are anti-woman mandatory hijab regulation. There are anti-LGBT regulation, curfew at night for women. There is a regulation that bar women from straddling motorcycle. They have to sit sideways because if women open their legs for riding a motorcycle, it will arouse men's sexuality. That's insane. And there are many of regulations like this over the last 20 years. And the blasphemy law, for instance, in the new criminal code, the blasphemy article is expanded from 1 to 6 article. And then the article that will affect press freedom, 16 in the new criminal code. My dear friend, Janet friend, Atma Kusuma Astra Atmaja, he already passed away. He told me, gimana kita nih Apung Andreas? Kok KUHP buatan sendiri? Our own Indonesia, made in Indonesia criminal code is worse than buatan Belanda. Janet cannot say that. I can say that. Pak Atma can say that. KUHP buatan Indonesia lebih buruk daripada KUHP buatan Belanda.
Yeah,
Can
it's
do this.
Yeah. So now, journalism is under siege. So
not only journalism, the freedom of expression, freedom of association, women's rights, religious minorities, the protection of religious minorities, children's rights, they're all under siege in Indonesia. And
but anyways,
slow burning. This is going to make Indonesia a more repressive society.
Could we hope with influencers or content creators? Like in America, I know Johnny Harris, or in Indonesia, Ferry Irwandi maybe, or could we expect them replacing what, let's say, mainstream media did in the past?
Well, again, there's a difference between media and journalism, right? That we can talk about. Yes, they are. It's interesting. The Reuters Foundation also does its annual digital news report, and I don't do the survey, but I write the narrative, and so I highlighted the legal challenges that are coming up, also the political challenges. Having the president criticize Tempo for being funded by foreigners. This is sort of, these are fighting words. That gets people riled up, and so all of that. But looking just at the data from the survey, it's very interesting how young people, they don't want to read. They prefer to watch news, and they say they get their news from social media, which could very well be Compass, Republica, and Tempo, but could also very well be some of this homeless media that is not, they think they're getting news, but they're just getting stuff from influencers, or it's stuff that's been pirated from other legitimate websites. And so that's a scary development, this distinction between this idea that somehow media or journalism, that it's not the same as we talked about before. So I find these rather worrying trends, that if Gunawan said, 20 years ago said you can't have Pantau magazine because nobody reads. Well, at this point, it's gotten to the point where really nobody reads, that people will say they'd rather, at least then people would say they like to read. Now they say they'd rather just watch. And so that's worrisome.
Yeah, so basically we still have good journalism out there, but the problem is that not many people read them.
Right, yeah.
As it used to be. We know that there was agenda setting back then, so the media basically provide everything on the table. You just need to choose.
Bill Keller of the New York Times called this era as the era of the tsunami of information. The tsunami. We have so much water, debris, houses, cars, or whatever, broken houses. With journalism, there are goalkeepers, gatekeepers of verified information, and we can drink the water from this gatekeeper. The tsunami water, we cannot drink them. We need to clean them, and it takes time. We don't know. Bill Keller, Bill Kovacs, they still don't know how to handle all this revolution in communication, the tsunami of information.
Okay, so we are closing to 1 hour. So do you have anything to say that I haven't asked, but you think it's important for people to know?
Well, you've been very good. You've asked really good questions. Yeah, I just think I wrote an article about the press law, the making of the press law, and I really believe it was the jewel in the crown of Reformasi, that without that press law, all the other things that happened wouldn't have been possible, that it was the press law that allowed Indonesians to, and open independent media that allowed Indonesians to know what was going on. And without that, we're in a real mess as a society. And I think Indonesians need to guard their treasure, that press law. And I think they are. I think that there are so many NGOs and journalist groups and activists and pro-democracy young people that care about this. And so that always heartens me, energizes me. It's one reason I love teaching that class with Andreas, is that you meet all these young people who, they weren't even born when all this stuff happened, but reminding them of how important a legacy it is and how they have to protect it. I mean, you can look at what's happening in the United States and see how fragile democracy is, that we have to all fight to protect it all the time. We can't take anything for granted. So.
Andreas, do you have anything to say for your final statement?
This is a very difficult time. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us.
Mm-hmm. Lord of the Ring, there, right there. No, it's
a lot of even the smallest person can change the course of the future. The Lord of the Ring.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Andreas. I hope you enjoy the show, and until next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.